Thank you, everybody, for joining us with the Legislative Review Committee. We have a quorum. Anybody have any changes to the minutes? Hearing none, the minutes are accepted. Do we have any public input? Hearing none, we've got just this one item on our agenda. We've been talking about the noise ordinance. Commissioner Thornton asked that I list the attendance of Judge Ryan Hope, the municipal court judge, to talk to us about something that we were discussing last cycle with the sort of futility of writing these noise ordinance tickets over and over again that don't seem to result in any change in behavior. So maybe how these tickets are interacting with the courts and how maybe we can use or encourage the court system to maybe enhance our enforcement procedure or how that all works. Mr. Jones, do you have any input?
Just a little bit. As I understand from the last meeting, one of the recommendations, actually, I think there was a motion made that staff come back with a policy. After Judge Hope presents on whatever information that you guys need, I'd love to talk about policy versus standard operating procedure and what may work best for the organization in the long run.
Great. So picking up where we left off last meeting, we were talking about what seems to be a problem here where Mr. Hansford we have the Deputy Chief here as well. Thank you for coming. We have a situation where specific properties are getting multiple noise ordinance violation citations, and you know, they're just paying them and writing them off as a cost of doing business, and meanwhile they just keep violating, and it's turning into a nuisance. And you know, those nuisances come to us, so we're trying to do something about it. So Judge Hope, could you maybe just kind of give us the lay of the land, you know, in your court, if you see a specific property owner coming to you 6, 7, 8 times in a 6-month, 1-year period, you know, what's happening? I mean, are we just kind of stuck in the same routine where we're just assessing a fine and moving on, or what's going on here?
And it, you know, to give an email, I know I've already reported some of this, but just for public consumption, the process is important to understand as to what gets before me, because quite frankly, none of these cases get before me. So how this all starts is that if there's a complaint, then usually it's a police officer that's going to respond to these, not code enforcement. The officer decides that there is a probable cause to believe a violation has occurred, they're going to cite that individual for a noise violation. Even prior to the change in the law that we did locally with the Freedom Act, this is not the type of ordinance people would have been arrested for, like disorderly conduct or public intoxication. This was a citable offense even before that change in the law a few years ago. And the situation is that those tickets are set up much like traffic tickets are. Most traffic tickets that individuals receive in Athens-Clarke County have a preset payable fine that if the individual wants to accept responsibility for that behavior, they can pay a fine and never even have to come to their court date, but they have a designated court date on the citation. So noise ordinance violation, same thing. There is a court date that the individual is given right then and there when they're cited. If they want to challenge the ticket, obviously, they would need to come to court on that date. But it's a payable ticket that they can also pay a fine prior to that date. I think it starts out at $250, I think is what our preset amount is for a first violation. There is an escalator that if it's a second violation, it's a $350 fine. That's the only escalator that exists right now. And that's somewhat controlled by the court itself. We designate on the traffic side of things, for example, certain cases are payable tickets and certain cases are court only. You have to come to court to deal with this matter. On the traffic side of things, that designation is usually on the level of seriousness of the offense. So just a stop sign violation where there's no accident, nobody's harmed, that's a payable ticket. Someone who's charged with an under 21 speeding above a certain speed, they're subject to having their license suspended. We don't make that a payable ticket because we don't want them to pay that ticket and not realize they're going to lose their license when they pay that ticket. We want to make sure they come to court to understand that as a possible consequence. So that we have a variety of traffic offenses where we analyze them on a case-by-case basis. Should this be a payable matter, or should this be something where someone always has to come to court? Right now, noise violations fall in their payable tickets. The one thing that can get every case out of that payable ticket category is if the officer writes on the ticket, court only, it gets out from all of that. Whether it's a traffic offense, an ordinance offense, no matter what it is, there is no preset fine if the officer, as they cite the individual, writes court only on the ticket. That takes it out of preset, the person has to come to court and answer to the charge. For the people that do come to court at arraignment, that first court date, that's just a court date where the individual is made aware of their rights. The fact that they have a right to a trial, right to representation, they're told what the maximum possible penalty is. That's where all these cases are getting resolved if they aren't paid before their court date. And I'm not getting a single plea that actually comes before me. The individual might ask to speak with the prosecutor out in the hallway. The prosecutor might negotiate with them. The prosecutor might listen to them and feel they have a reasonable defense and that they can't prove the case. And those cases are almost always either being dismissed, which I think you guys saw the spreadsheets. There's maybe one or two of those a year that are being dismissed. Or they're paying the preset fine because the prosecutor said, no, I think that's a fair fine. Or the prosecutor is reducing the fine. And I'll tell you, knowing our prosecutor, if there's a reduction in that 250 or that 350, it's because there's a financial hardship for that individual. So if one of these entities that, I hear through the grapevine, I don't know this to be true, but I know people accept it to be true. If it is a fraternity house that has the budget to pay their fines, that wouldn't be the type of person I would expect our prosecution to reduce a fine for. But let's say it was in an apartment complex and neighbor to neighbor, and the individual that comes to court is unemployed at the time and, understands they did something wrong, but can't afford to pay a $250 fine. That's usually the kind of person that our prosecutor, who's Ms. Landritz from the Solicitor General's office, that's usually where you're going to see a fine reduction. So I have never had a blind plea on one of these cases. People can enter what's called a blind plea. If they don't like what's being recommended by the prosecutor in arraignment, but they want to accept responsibility, they can enter a blind plea in front of me, and I can determine what the appropriate penalty is. It could be jail time, because it's punishable by up to 6 months in jail, $1,000 fine or both. I think it's the general penalty provision for this offense. I can fine them $1. I can go anywhere in between the maximums and the minimums. I've never once in 5 years had a blind plea or a trial on the noise ordinance case. So every single case that's been cited has either paid before the court date, shown up and negotiated with the prosecutor and paid outside my presence at the pay window, or the prosecutor has dismissed the case.
So we have, the first violation, 250, second and all subsequent 350. Is there a time when it restarts, or is it just in perpetuity, or associated with the land in perpetuity? Escalates to 350 and that's it.
A few years ago, one concern that came up was that if you do have these locations where it's either a business or a situation with multiple people living in a house, if different people are the cited party every time, they might get out from under that escalator.
Yeah.
And so we did change the policy probably about 3 years ago, if I remember correctly, to focus on the address, the incident location, and not the individual that's cited, because it's the source of the noise is usually tied to the location more than a person. And so we did make that change a few years ago, and it is in perpetuity.
Yeah.
As far as if it's in our database, the clerks are supposed to screen that ticket, look for the location, and attach the escalator. What we're really expecting, and I don't know if there's ever been a lot of coordination between the Solicitor General's office and the police department, is if there is some really repeat terrible behavior that needs to be addressed, that the officers know right court only. And that makes it have to come to the court. So for 10 years, I did the NOVIC training for police officers, new officer basic course. Is that what it is?
It is.
And so I did the portion about misdemeanor offenses. I did domestic violence and a few other things. But this is part of what I trained people for 10 years was, if you think this is something that's a little more serious and that shouldn't just be resolvable prior to a court date by payment of a fine, write court only on it, and that person will have to come to court to address the case. Now,
But had to come to court, they still would only have.
they still have that next filter. No, I mean, they're fixing the maximum possible penalty, and then that court only lets the prosecutor know. Well, the officer thinks there's a bigger issue going on here. Maybe I need to analyze this case a little bit more. So it would heighten the awareness of everybody further down the line if a case was designated as court only, because we know that's not the typical course of business. Now, whether or not at this point, I'm not trying to, there's turnover, there's all kinds of things going
The
on.
prosecutor can ask for more.
Prosecutors can ask for more court only. If it's court only, it becomes their ball.
So 350 is the floor.
350 is if you want to accept responsibility
Yeah.
before you even come to court, or if you want to pay up once you hear the speech in the morning,
Yeah.
that's a preset amount. But once it's written court only, then it's up to the prosecution what they think is a fair sentence for that particular case.
Up to 1,000, 6 months in jail. Interesting. So I guess maybe this issue with this one address with, well, I'm sure there's more out there. Maybe Deputy Chief, you can illuminate for us the discretion there with officers and the communication and tracking of information to where that discretion would be triggered to write for somebody.
Absolutely. Well, there's no specific direction we've given them on court only or not. So in this case, do this, in this case, do that. However, like the judge said, there are situations where they determine there is a significant measure and they will mark the citation court only. And that's with any citation that they issue. We have traffic citations where they can do that. So typically when we receive a call, it's entered in, it's dispatched, they go to the scene, and they determine whether or not there's a noise ordinance violation. We've operated under the inform, educate, and then warn, and then cite process, where they usually make contact with somebody, determine if there's a violation, educate them on the noise ordinance, and there may be a warning given from that. If they return, there may be a citation issued from that. The challenge with us is those may happen at different times with different officers,
Right.
Sometimes even on different days, and them understanding the history of those locations. In some of our more prolific locations, it's a little more known, but on our end, we've got to do a better job of coordinating that. We've given the officers some direction, and that is essentially going out and determining whether or not there's a noise ordinance violation, and then reporting back to dispatch, there was or there wasn't, then determining whether or not it's cited or a warning was given, logging that information. We're also telling the officers now that they need to make sure that they check the history of that location when they go out, so they're familiar what the activity has been there. We've also asked them just to log who they had contact with in the call. But, we're specifically interested in whether or not there was a violation and if that information is logged, and using that to keep better track of them.
So as Mr. Jones alluded to before, talking about policy and standard operating procedures, do you envision maybe some sort of standard operating procedure guidance to where if an officer sees that, okay, this is the 8th time we've come out here in 6 months, according to standard operating procedure that we've learned about before,
Right.
there's a strong likelihood I'm going to write court only on this.
Correctly, and I think
If I could, real quick, so a little context here, had a conversation with TC Daniel about this very situation prior to, and it sounds like y'all have already implemented this new standard operating procedure with your.
we have. Yes, those are the expectations that we've set out to them. Also, any warnings need to be in writing, so we have that documented as well. So
Okay.
we've just recently done that, and I think that was more on the heels of that conversation. But that's the direction we're going with it, just to have a little bit better process on our part. I would be careful to lock them into any specific policy,
Sure.
hardline policy, because I think there are some situations that require a level of discretion there, as with anything, or factors that come into play. And I would want to make sure that we don't tie them down to that. However, I would also want to make sure that, we set an expectation.
Sure.
What were those 3 things you said you do first? You said educate, such and such, such.
With our officers, we tell them that when they make contact with somebody, we're looking for them to inform, educate, warn, and then cite. So we want them to have some conversation with them first.
So if we're not looking at a policy, and I struggle with policy all the time. So if we have Joe Blow's Club and they get to the 3rd one or the 2nd, is it possible to at least send them something in writing saying that the next offense may be a court order offense?
I mean, we could add that into that process, but I think a lot of that's gonna occur when we warn them or educate them on the
The
actual.
reason I said that is because you said it, that you have different officers at different times, different folk, who may be new, that might be the smallest thing they forget. But if there is something that is sent after, I'm not trying to penalize people for having fun and making noise.
Right.
But I am concerned about my constituents that can't sleep when they're having fun and making noise. So my constituents just wanted, a decent hour to so they can rest. And I saw on People's Court yesterday, they were talking about noise ordinances, and they said that the person complaining could set up one of those cameras and record the noise and that. But I don't think it's gotten that far that we gotta go to court and, well, it may be in somebody's area, but not mine. But I do think that there needs to be a separate written notice somewhere. Even after the officer writes it on the ticket, administratively, you get a letter and say, this is blah, blah, the next one could be court. Order.
Court only.
Yeah.
Sure, I mean, that's something we can certainly look at and see.
So, if I could real quick, so we were focusing on the reoccurrence of violators of the noise ordinance. And as I remember, we came to y'all and said, we don't have a good way of tracking. So that's not a good enough answer, right? So what we thought would be best is if we changed our standard operating procedures to do a better job of tracking. So what DC Kelly was just talking about is a way that we can actually track where we've gone before, what the action was. So the officers, it doesn't matter who goes out there, knows what the past action was. So they understand where we are in the process. Are we at citation 2? Or are we at 1? They've implemented this right now. And also Doug and I have talked today. I think Doug actually has an opportunity to do something similar with a new piece of software. So if I can ask Mr. Hansford to talk to that a little bit.
Sure. I was telling Manager Jones that it's rare really that we have repeat offenders for construction noise. It just doesn't happen. We typically will let them know we can stop work on the project if it continues, and that's a pretty good deterrent. We have had a couple of instances where early garbage pickup happened before 5 a.m. on a commercial site. In that case, it would be in our new database, our Clarity software. But going back to the construction, if it happened, normally when we get a noise complaint on construction activity, it goes into the permit file, and that permit file is isolated. And so in the future, looking back, we might not know that that particular builder had a violation unless we remembered it. So with our new software, we have permit files and we have contacts files. And so what I told Assistant Manager Jones we could do is attach the violation, a record of the complaint to the contact file instead of the permit file. And that way, when it happens the second time, we can go look at his information and find out that was, and in that case, we can just have a citation issued. My thought is you do it one time and you might claim you didn't know the ordinance, but once we have a record that you were informed and educated on the ordinance, then it's time to step in and citation.
Okay.
And the last thing I'll say is in all cases, we're going to have to go back and evaluate what we've done and whether the steps have actually bearing fruit.
Yeah.
Yeah, a couple questions. One is, am I understanding correctly that a standard operating procedure is basically just a policy that's not in writing? Like policies are in writing and SOPs are just understandings that are communicated verbally, or is there actually a written component?
We have standard operating or general orders, and it's a written policy that's pushed out to staff. Everybody has to sign off on it and then follow it.
So maybe I was using the word policy before and implying one thing, but you just used the word policy in your description.
I did.
And I guess I'm trying to make sense of I guess I was hoping to see in writing something that captures what you described, so we could kind of have the opportunity to just be like, yes, this captures exactly what we're trying to get at, or, oh, we'd really like to tweak this. And so one example that comes to mind is when we're assessing repeat offenders, are we looking at both address and person? Because it sounds like part of the issue we've gotten into here is you go to a fraternity house and it's a different person every time claiming responsibility, even though it's the same group of people causing a problem. Right. And so how are we like documenting repeat offenders? Are we looking at both now, or?
We're logging it, we're checking the location, and then we have the individual that they had contact with noted in the call. So we would check both of those. When you bring up one, then you see the other. I think what we've done really is we've established a practice of how we're handling these calls. A policy would be a general order where we would push something out in writing, but we've directed everybody via practice right now. We want to see how this works, and then if we need to make any adjustments.
You've directed everybody via a practice that someone somewhere in the police department has like a sheet of paper outlining what that practice is that you're communicating.
It's handled, it's pushed down from their supervisors, and it's not
So it is-
written per se.
Oh,
But
okay.
we've directed them to do that when they have their briefings with the officers.
I see what you're saying, Commissioner Hool. So semantics here, policy, when I think of policy, is something very general. And standard operating procedures is how we operate on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, yeah, so I guess I'd be interested in understanding what's written to capture that daily operating procedure around this issue, because it seems like that's basically what we're just trying to make sure we're all on the same page about to finally put this to bed. And then I'll just throw out there while we're here that the idea of the board only as the way forward here makes a lot of sense to me. But I just hope that we find ways to provide some kind of escalation for accountability that seems necessary, but that doesn't involve jail, you know? So fines is one tool. I don't know if there's other tools that can be explored. Not a big fan of incarcerating people, especially.
I just prejudge these types of cases, but when I tell people in court about ordinance cases and the maximum possible penalty, I say that's a maximum possible penalty. That is not a frequent or a likely outcome. I'm very explicit about that. That on the continuum of cases that even come to my court, this would not typically be a jail time type of situation. Chief Kelly, one question I have for you, where do training bulletins enter into the hierarchy of what you were describing? Because I remember when we did the uniform misdemeanor citation, they created a training bulletin around that.
Correct. So, we have our general orders, and then we have training bulletins which speak more to policies general orders or practices. They're more of an informative educational tool. It's pushed out electronically as well. Everybody signs off on those, acknowledging that they've read the training bulletin. So this is how we would do that initial education. We have not pushed this out yet as a training bulletin, but that's one way we do things without implementing them. Because it may be more informational in knowledge or explain a policy and why a policy is and how action's taken.
I want to throw out.
Hold on one sec, sorry. Commissioner Myers, then Wright, then Thorpe.
Yeah, I just wanted, I'm following this training bulletin. I keep getting a little back and forth whether or not this is in writing or not in writing. And if it is in writing or when it is, as an example, not that I want to see everything that the police department has, but as an example, I would appreciate seeing a copy of what we're talking about. And likewise, just the stuff about knowing the information when you're out in the field. You mentioned a database, so we're talking about there's something, I'm a police officer out there, I can go into the computer, and now there's gonna be a way for me to pull up whether or not someone has had a noise violation at this address. And that wasn't the case, there's some change being made?
Well, what we're doing now is telling them when they go out to these calls, we want you to do this. That information is there. It's logged in our computer-aided dispatch system. And either our dispatchers or the officers can look at the history of an address. We're telling them to make sure that they include certain information in a response and that they check that back. They go back and look at it where they may or may not have done that.
Okay, so
before.
the technology was there before, now we're just using it more effectively,
Correct.
both in entering data and using it as well.
I'm confident we're getting at to what
Yeah.
we're being asked to do. It's just, it sounds like y'all will see it, right?
Yeah.
A couple people.
Yeah, I'm good. I'm sorry, Miss Allison, I'm sorry, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Good. We couldn't even clap on that one.
Okay, I really appreciate this. I did some background checking, not background, can't say that to the police. Or the attorney. I was looking at the addresses that were on our lovely chart from last time, one Greek. So I think we should just be, sort of talking about locations instead of assuming they're Greek, because I think we all may have been surprised that they, with that. One example that is in my district, it's in it has two charts. If you combine those two numbers, it's 17 in the lead with the one in your district as the most. And the difference is 288 Bailey Street and 288 Bailey Street Unit 1 U. So this kind of goes back to a little bit of what you're saying is what's written down to where when you did your bar chart, it was literally two different addresses. And I guess for you guys in your pattern of visiting, it is good to know which unit it is. And I guess that reflects that you went there
A lot.
12 times without knowing which unit.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
And so that is information for you. It might look confusing when we ask for it, printing it out, but it's because of how you guys are battling what is happening on the front line.
correct. And I haven't seen that document, but I can tell you just from my experience, sometimes we get calls where it's somewhere in 288 Bailey Street, so we don't have a unit to tie it to, and maybe when they get out there, the noise is stopped, so the location stays the same. Other times we have people that say, it's 288 Bailey Street, number 1, the music is loud, we go out there and it's logged specifically. Sometimes the location they may contact and it may not get changed for one reason or another. That's something we really push with our staff to make sure that the location is correct, so I can kind of speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's just an example of the variety of
Yes.
repetition that you have. And another thing that I think maybe is harder, one, it sounds like you're addressing a little more consistency and the approach with the address. I like the idea of the port only coming in at a strategic point consistently. And this might piggyback a little bit, Jesse, about what you were saying is understanding that at all of these, the person it's given to could very well be different. So that follow-up to maybe lets the property owner know what's happening, that their tenant, or whoever was handed that, is never going to tell their landlord. Or,
Right.
the manager's not going to tell the landlord. So I don't know if we can how we can solve that, but as a committee, if that's something we were to try to get more communication to the property owner. I thought we did that with our house ordinance of the unruly houses. We had it looped into the property owner,
Right.
Also knowing it. And that was
Record, yeah, right.
because we started off with the short-term rental. How do you, that person, they don't care if they got a fine or whatever. But, so that could be, if this continues from our learning to continue to want more steps, maybe we could, see what we could piggyback with that.
Mr. Wright, I'm not familiar with the unruly house ordinance.
I'm not saying the term. What is
It was in that PowerPoint.
Well,
that I sent you. It has- Yeah, that's the house, that's.
Okay.
Am I saying it the right way? Let's
I can pull it up.
Yeah.
Unruly gatherings.
Yes.
Gatherings.
Technically.
Yeah, and it was, addressing
Okay.
things and it's
I know.
in the property owner, which was a
I know, Sean.
key point there, but, I don't know how that plans out, and it could really be more relevant once you get into these higher numbers of visits too. But I applaud the permanent contact file that you guys are doing with that software and learning, like we say, is we just want compliance versus getting people in trouble.
And I'm vetoing, Commissioner Wright. So where do we go? No, one more thing. In my community, I was concerned about one particular, club. And what I have come to find out is that they change ownerships, not just the person who works there that night. Actually, they change ownerships. So, but if we go to the address as being the, the point where we start at, that doesn't change the situation, does it? If somebody says, well, I just started leasing this club, I didn't know nothing what they did before, so does that backtrack the situation?
Well, if under the officer's discretion, they get a court only, they then would go to court
Okay.
and they could talk to the prosecutor and say,
Okay.
look, I just bought this place.
Okay,
And the prosecutor's not bound by any of the preset fines, either lower or higher.
okay,
So if somebody came and presented something mitigating,
Mhm.
they could go less than what they normally would have done, thinking, well, now I've had five priors,
okay.
but you're a new owner, you're saying you're gonna be responsible, I'll keep an eye out for you in the future.
Okay.
That's how that conversation would go.
Right. And my next thing with all of this discussion, and if my constituents are not watching, what am I going to say is our next move? Are we just to
I
that?
think you could explain how the police have modified their standard operating procedures to give written warnings so that they're better tracking the visits to these locations. And that they've also modified their procedures to
Check the history of
check
locations.
history, they can see the history. And also the discretion to write court only.
Correct.
Okay,
And escalating can actually happen by this.
right. By tracking the history, the discretion to write court only can be informed by how many times they've been there.
What we can do is make sure that we give that to everyone here, so that you're not just speaking from the top of your head.
Oh, I love that.
You'll have
That would be
documents.
perfect. That would be perfect.
And then you'll see that in writing, right?
Okay. That's fine for me. That's all I need in writing, but yes, I like that.
Yeah, I like where this is headed. I might be recalling this a bit inaccurately, but refresh my memory, attorneys, please. We had talked about this question of who gets notified, who gets cited, and this issue of being able to cite a property owner if they're not there would require that they've somehow been notified of the issue ahead of time. Am I remembering that correctly? I thought I remembered there was some issue around if you're trying to cite a property owner, you can't do that unless you can prove that they were aware of an issue. So am I misremembering that?
I don't think so.
I mean, we cite people all the time for issues related to
If
the
you violate
property
the law,
management.
violate the law, yeah.
I'm just thinking about like all of our code enforcement cases, a lot of times we're citing people who aren't even, like they're owners of property that aren't even local.
Absence, the old absence.
Mhm.
So yeah, I guess like trying to think creatively about like how do we sort of provide this escalation in a way that doesn't, add too much burden to the courts or, moving people to having to be in jail. I really don't want that.
Right. And Commissioner Bull, what you may be referring to is that when an officer is issuing a citation, they're issuing it to a person right then and there. So that may be why the property owner is not being notified, because, yeah, they're issuing it to a tenant or a manager of the club or something. I don't know that later on a second citation is not issued to the property owner. There's only been one citation and that's handed to the individual that's there.
Okay, so you were just describing it. What was going to be my question is, could one of the layers of this, like say it starts off, you give your warning or whatever to the people who are there. You don't need to notify their landlord. It's their first time being an issue, right? But then there's some kind of escalation after that where they're getting, at some stage in this, that court-only citation, and we're notifying their property owner. But should that notification to their property owner also put them on notice that next time this happens, they will be cited too? Is there a way to kind of cite essentially two entities for these issues that persist repeatedly and repeatedly? Cite the people on site and the property owner.
I think the answer to that is that there's history of that in a code enforcement context, because a lot of times we don't know. For instance, like if like the building is physically falling apart, is that the tenant not maintaining it, or is the landlord, or is it both? I don't think there's any history of that though when we're talking about things that the police department typically enforces. That's usually the person who's on site receives that citation. So
could there be a layer of this where if what we're doing here doesn't solve the problem of some places having 17 complaints, is there a way that when you issue that court-only citation, you also notify code enforcement to issue the property owner an additional citation? And I'm thinking, maybe a good way to try to resolve this is if they've both got a court-only date where they've got to appear in front of you at the same time, maybe you can help them figure out how to keep it from happening again.
that unruly house, I've not had any of those come before me. Does any of that, like if you have repeat noise issues? I don't deal with short-term rental situations.
They may be, it's supposed to be dealing with everybody, but that might be the only ones that it's applied to.
Yeah, I think looking at the noise control ordinance, I think a lot of it would really depend on the exact language of the ordinance, and we might need to look at that to come back to you. So for example, if we're talking about mechanical sound making devices, that particular section says it's unlawful for any person or persons to play, use, operate, or permit to be played. So that that arguably could be a landlord who knowingly is allowing that to be played. But when we look to other ordinances, so look at the human produced sounds. It's unlawful for any person or person to yell, shout, hoot, etc. That's an affirmative act of that individual, and so you could not cite a property owner under that section. Does that make sense? It really just depends on the wording of the ordinances. Now that could be revised, but that's my instinct.
And somebody mentioned short-term rentals, so that's another thing that's on my mind, is like, you have a bunch of first-time offenders, but, a property owner in a densely populated neighborhood who's repeatedly having these short-term rental guests be a problem. At what point do we hold them accountable, and how?
Where is it? Which one? Which one get to?
It's chapter 4.
And so it sounds to me like what this all adds up to is somewhere in this, we would do well to have what y'all are doing, your databases talk to each other. So that if there is a way to get to a point where we're doing that, I guess what we'll call it like a dual citation, that you all would advise code enforcement to follow through on that latter next part. Okay.
What is it?
Let's see.
Residents.
Residence.
That's just the definition.
Joining residential. We were definitely coming in, more single family.
Next.
Then we'll have to update that with the,
Yeah, subjecting the owner and or the responsible party. So it's specifically written in that statute, the owner or the responsible party could be cited. So in that, if you're citing under this unruly gathering, then yes, you could cite the short-term rental tenant and the property owner, because it's specifically mentioned in the ordinance of who is responsible for the noise. Whereas what she was reading is the person who's actually making the noise. So you couldn't cite, if I, for instance, ran in my house and decided, right, 2:00 every morning, I go outside and scream my head off. I can be cited for that, not the person I'm renting the house from.
The 2:00 hoot, I think is what it's.
Yes.
So this ordinance could be used for a club?
No.
no,
Got it.
It has to be
Has to be a residence. Got it.
right. But I'm saying if you changed, you would have to write the ordinance for the
To mimic that.
to mimic that, to say that it would be that. Yeah. And so the only logistical question then is if we have this kind of two ways that citations are administered, in other words, if police comes out and they give something to the person who's on site, if code enforcement, for instance, is now going to be the one who issues citation to the landlord, like how does that work? It's not a process that I think exists currently. Doesn't mean it couldn't.
Yeah, I guess what I'm imagining is if what we're doing is creating a better database here, a better documentation system, we just sort of define policy, standard operating procedure, whatever one call the thing that defines. At this point, when you've achieved this level of escalation on the police side, then like that kicks over to code enforcement, like, hey, you all also follow up with the property owner.
So I can't really speak to the administrative operability of all of this. How would it work? Like, logistically?
Well, I think the first question is, what is the threshold where we would notify code enforcement? That would help us understand what the level of interaction would be, and then build a system around that. Because if it's a fairly low level of interaction or occurrence, then it may be a matter of, if it's, and I'm just throwing one out, if it's a court-only citation, then we inform code enforcement directly. If it's something more common, then you're talking about systems integration. That's a little more complex, and we really have to dig into that. And if there's some kind of automated solution, just due to the volume that we've been encountering. Sorry to answer a question with a question.
I would suggest is if bringing in the prosecutor that would handle these, right? Because I'm anticipating a situation where you're citing not only the person who is there at this party or unruly gathering and also the property owner. When they get to court, fingers are just gonna point at each other and ultimately who's gonna be held responsible. So that would be an issue for your prosecutor to determine. I don't know if that would be an office-wide policy, but that's what's gonna happen when they go to court is property owners gonna say, no, look, here's my lease that they signed that says you will not have loud parties. I wasn't there, and now we've just got things pointing at each other, and has anyone ever held responsible?
Yeah, and I guess my hope is that's where the prosecutor's just like, cool, let's take it to the judge to help do what judges do best.
Yeah, and that's, yeah, for the prosecutor discretion.
Yeah, the reality is that these kind of cases rarely, if ever, go to trial. Judge Hope could certainly speak to that, but I mean, the ordinance trials are very few.
I would also note, if we put so much on the employee staff to do, that may be a disincentive for them to actually do the work. We might see like another outcome, right? Like,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like if it's too much work, you're like, well, I rode with y'all, right? There's a lot going on. And a noise ordinance we did, or a noise violation we did go to, we'll go there, don't hear anything, immediately go to something else. I mean, like, I'm concerned about, how it's gonna work for the officer actually out in the field. Are they writing two separate things,
Yeah, so, I think maybe for our next meeting, we could maybe just get something from the police that shows us some of these standard operating procedures. And, and then,
We'll do something similar for
yeah, I mean, my
inspection.
inclination is to see how the changes play out. If we're still dealing with the same problem 6 months from now or whatever, then maybe the mayor can refer it back or we can do something else. But I mean, the fact that we'll now be tracking all the warnings and the citations at a specific address and we're informing officers that the commission has made clear we want to see some court onlys for some of these repeat offenders, we're talking about 3 or 4 properties really,
Sure.
That concurs with what I was trying to get to with the summary is, learning from the awareness this study has done. And, we have 365 days out of the year. This chart is, limited in that mode. But when we start hearing about it, then we, as a commissioner, we can go back to the processes that are in place as well. And I also noted back to my Bailey Street, you guys have it listed here as, likely gang-related activity. I would rather the police spend their time on the gang-related activity that the noise has brought them to, which is where the violence is versus the annoyance. Same with maybe some of these other repetitions that are there. As far as going to the landlord, a lot of these are apartment. You're going to tell Howard Johnson's, you're going to tell another one in my district, the in-town suites. I mean, a lot of these are multifamily and likely people that, due to their lack of affordable housing, are living long-term in a hotel, which would make anybody go out at 2 a.m, just from the frustrations that could also impound on them. There's several hotels and the University Oaks on. I know you guys get a lot of calls besides noise to a lot of these places. So with the grand scheme of the violence and issues that the community is working with, I think that these improvements are good for the topic at hand.
Yeah, I'm videoing that, and I'm looking at, I don't know what page it was, but it's the hotspot map. And they're listed like, several streets. And what would be interesting, this data was pulled up, I guess, because we requested it for this discussion. What does this data look like in 6 months if we started in January? If we, what is the trend going to decrease using, so I think there should be some point measures as LRC to at least in 6 months, see if we're seeing some type of decrease or change And I agree with, Alice on the gang activity, but we surely should not take this document and not follow it or monitor it until we have this kind of discussion again. You've given us something that we didn't have before.
Mhm.
We can see it in black and white, black and white, black and white, red, green, this is George, that's all I'm trying to tell. But maybe this will give, I'm not trying to create no more extra work for you. I promise you I'm not. But this should be a beginning of a roadmap that we can monitor and make changes if needed.
Okay,
Great.
absolutely.
All right, Commissioner Wolf.
So, I mean, can we just move to put this item on hold for however many months? And then we'll
6
just
months.
revisit, 6 months, and we'll revisit it with the report back, and then you all can just share with us the written version of the standard operating procedures for us to have in mind
Thanks.
between now and 6 months from now.
I think it's rare.
And then we don't need to follow up next month with another meeting on this, right? We're just gonna kind of see how it sits.
So the baseline would be what we've handed out before, and then we'll implement new standard operating procedures, and we'll come back and see where we're at.
Right.
Yeah.
And you're gonna get some,
I'm talking about this.
Yeah.
Can I just, I want to clarify something. So, I mean, I heard loud and clear the judge saying, never have you had this, about this come before you, right? And what I was,
As a blind plea or as a trial.
as a trial, yeah. And I think what I was trying to understand, and you brought this up, Attorney Hines, this to Attorney Pappas, is, where in this using the court-only process, I guess what I'm imagining is a way for us to basically like force the two parties, the tenant and the landlord, because most of these, maybe not all, but most seem to be a tenant, a rental situation, to have a mediated conversation with each other. I guess that's sort of my idea, is that like somewhere in this process we're trying to set up, part of that escalation isn't just about like higher fines or threatening an even bigger, punishment, but that there's also, we build in some kind of mechanism for that kind of mediation. So yeah, when people do get in front of each other and point fingers at each other, there's someone there to be like, okay, well, we've got to figure out how this doesn't happen again for either of you, right?
Yeah, I mean, that
How
could
do we like kind of, is there a way that we can structurally do this that creates that outcome after there's 10 citations or something?
My concern is that would get into their private right of contract as far as who they allow to be their tenant, but I don't know that you could, even with a criminal case pending, that you could force two individuals who are facing the same potential fine to come to some sort of agreement. Yeah, I don't know how that would.
I mean, you'd be charging two people with the same crime.
Yeah.
That's kind of, well, I mean, I think we have to draft new policy that, yeah.
But isn't there also the situation where, Allison is referring to the contract that says, you can't make a lot of noise, right? But I'm thinking more of the situation, let's say on Bailey Street, the landlord's somewhere else. If that's even in there, how would the landlord even know if these cases had happened so that the responsible landlord, let's say, could take action? Is there a way to communicate that? I mean, in my mind, if I'm renting something or even that apartment building, I can't be there all the time, but if I have something in there, I want to be able to deal with it. How would I even know that these violations are going on? So can one communicate that? Can we as a county government communicate that to the landowner that these violations have gone on?
I think that would have to be something that municipal court would take on as far as like sending, a citation was paid. Of course, any landowner could make an open records request for, have there been any citations issued for my address, but I don't know where.
Guess that's where you were going with
Yeah.
that, Commissioner Fuller, right? How's the property owner know?
Well, he was talking about the
We would
property
have
owner
property.
being responsible.
You
Yeah,
would send it to the address on the citation, which would just be the person who's just in a court paying the fine.
Right.
Circular, not really get at what you're discussing. And one thing to remember is, these guys are prosecuting these
Yeah.
cases. Solicitor General's office handles these cases, so.
Well, in my mind, as ideally that would be, I think that maybe more of an adversarial connection that we're establishing, that we're forcing a landlord to come in because of a bad tenant, that tenant might not get their lease renewed. They could end up being evicted. It could be the last straw. I ended up being told that I couldn't rent my house here anymore once because I was deducting the bug spray and the things I was using for the insects of the house I was renting. I was deducting it from my rent, and my landlord knocked on the door and said, "You're done here." Yeah, that was the last rent I paid there, and I was evicted. So I'm just saying that the places these people are living in, if we were to do the charge that we have for noise violation and then put on top of it domestic violence, gun violence, I think that there might be more things that we would want to communicate to these landowners than the noise thing. And I said at the last meeting, I wanted to bring with the litter ordinances and flyers that have been put out, and it's the kind of thing that I thought if we were to compile our noise ordinance things for the community, when people are asking and calling us about construction sites or noise ordinance, it could be that we could have what would be a community flyer based on the tons of information and the different noise problems that we have, so that the people who are complaining to us know who to call and can also understand the steps. So I brought this because I said I would, and then we could see how that might work for this topic as a part of the, let's see, inform and educate, warn system, as well as just some of our outreach.
So the PIO is currently working on something with the Department of Building Inspections related to tenant rights, or, so
yeah.
something similar. I can ask PIO to start looking into this. I couldn't tell you how quickly we can turn this around.
No, it's been food for thought, and it could be a follow-up because of those 4 steps that I think are really important, and that we get to communicate to our constituents, inform and educate. We can also get these things out. And so this is just what came about from I think this came from the litter abatement group. I'm about to jump back into that too. And keep Athens-Clarke County beautiful, and code enforcement was part of all that. So it's just another tool that we can have in communicating for compliance. And for me, it's also, we talk about being good neighbors or getting along. You've got the neighbor who's complaining about their neighbor. That's also a sticky thing. And, knowing that the police officer going out there, but you don't want to make it obvious who called. But yet they want to talk to who called to find out where the noise is. And then the person doesn't want to come out and be seen talking to who they called. So it's a delicate thing. And I guess I appreciate more how many times you get out there and then don't find it.
And then don't have a complaint.
And then the person's not, who called you doesn't want to be seen, but yet your mere presence may have changed.
Correct. So if some complainants to call in, they won't tell us, they don't want to tell us who they are. They don't want it in our computer system because then it's open record.
Yeah.
So then if the officer responds and can't find anything, they really have nowhere to go back to. Sometimes complainants do want to meet, and that presents the potential issue that you're speaking of. So it varies from call to call.
Well, I think too, in my mind, the alternative as well is, thankfully we have code enforcement in the police so that you have a neutral third party at least that can mediate, so you don't have neighbors knocking on each other's doors angry. I feel like they want to resist that. So I think we have some great, professionals who help try to balance that. You don't want to tattle on your neighbor, but you're also so pissed you don't want to knock on their door and get into a confrontation,
Exactly.
So you don't play a great role in helping. Yeah.
Looking at, again, the hotspot map, and Commissioner Wright brought to my attention, the first page, it is like a 7-year period. And then the second one gave us, it was year to date. And so I assume it's 7-year or 8-year now, because, and I guess what is jumping out at me is 7 years ago, and in other words, the more recent ones, it has grown, the area, the streets have grown. the area. So the noise has seemed to spread in other, or did you document it before? You see what I'm saying? You have 4 different streets on year to date that are not in the first hotspot map. So it looks like it's increasing to other areas.
It is, so this is over a 7-year period, you're right on the first one, and the second one is just year to date. And it looks like that it has increased, and again, I'm trying to understand this as I'm looking at it too, but it looks like it's increasing more recently, and that's as people have moved in, different people have moved in different places. It may be a house or an apartment that was there for several years, and now it's the current tenants generate loud music, or just.
The people who move from one spot to another.
That's right.
And so the noise
It could be that, so it can change, and then also as new properties come in, sometimes people are not used to having an apartment complex nearby and what comes with that, so that can change the dynamic as well.
So to suggest that we look at this in 6 months, is that not a good thought?
No, I think that is a good thought, because I'd like to see how these new changes that we've made really, how that affects the outcomes, and if we're checking histories and giving them warnings, and then in some cases, if we need to, citing them, is that changing it at all or not? So, and I want to see how those outcomes change. Now, these hotspot maps, if we get a call, even if we respond and cite them, it's still going to be a hotspot on one of these maps, one of these heat maps, because there was a response, and some of these actually may have citations or warnings tied to them. The data doesn't show that, but this is just showing that we've received a noise complaint at this location and the numbers.
You need a motion, we need a motion. What are you thinking?
Thank you, Lori. We'll make you take a hold.
We'll reflect it on the agenda and then we'll get it at the very bottom.
I think we're done. I don't, unless we.
Done.
To plot, can we plot our next meeting while we're all here?
Well, I mean, I was thinking, I don't even know if we need another meeting
Are
this
you,
year.
if you're really done?
I mean, I'm not sure what else we would talk about.
All right.
I'm with the chair.
Well, Chairman,
You know, we have a holiday, coming up this month.
it's been a pleasure serving on the committee with you.
All right,
We've
thank
been
you.
doing a lot of good work here.
Thanks.
I'm retiring from my job, so I'm retiring from this committee myself.
This is, he's got the bubble here.
Yeah.
This is getting down.
Yeah. All right, well, thanks staff, Mr. Jones, Mr. Hansford, Chief Kelly.
Judge Hope, thank you, sir.
Coming down.
Motion to adjourn?
Ms.
And attorney
Perkins, Ms. Pop. Best wishes
thank
to you and
Best
your new volunteer you've been working upon. Thank you for your help on the committee.
Saturday.
Yeah, it's great, so.
In
Yeah.
6 months, if you have any prosecution of noise ordinance information or this.
Come back, anytime, I won't be here, but come back.
There is not a state court in Walton County, so I will do misdemeanors and felonies, so that will be changed. I mean, you suggest felonies.
All kinds of minutia.
So any objection to an adjournment? All right, let's adjourn. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Todd.